What? Oh, brush my teeth. Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a lover of history, a tabletop game designer, and a lifelong player of Age of Empires 2. And on this series, Theorycrafting, I take civilizations and units not yet present in AoE2 and try to create, as best I can, a fitting framework for how they might appear if they were to be implemented in-game. For this episode, we're going to be hearkening back to my Moravians episode, where I mentioned in passing a civilization that I was considering from the same region, and wouldn't you know it, a commenter reached out to me. Yes, this episode we will be joined by the multi-talented Tomáš Staněk. He is a Czech cultural history and archaeology student and has helped immensely with this particular episode on the Silesians. Yes, indeed, the Silesians, a people that many of you, I dare say, probably have never heard of before. I certainly hadn't before I delved a lot more into Czech history, specifically for my Moravians video. But it's a really fascinating part of the world with a lot of very interesting history that Tomáš has done a fantastic job of walking me through, and I, in turn, hope to walk you through as well. So let's jump into it. But before then, some disclaimers on screen if you want to read them, as well as my philosophy as a game designer approaching this build. But before we begin, this episode is sponsored by our Discord server. Yes, indeed, the Lava Chamber Discord server is up and running. There is a link to join down in the description below. And as always, there will be a link to a comprehensive civilization document for this build down in the description, including all of the sources Tomáš consulted while putting together notes for the history section for me. He really went out of his way to actually consult academic sources for this thing. And so we're really up in the production quality here at the old Robbie Lava channel. Let's move on to Silesian history. Now, Silesia is, as mentioned, a not super well-known part of the world, and it is here. This little chunk of what is now Poland. Though, of course, as we'll get into, it also has substantial ties both to Czechia and, in many ways, to Germany as well. So just know, when we're talking Silesia, that is where it is. Silesian history begins well into prehistory, where some of the earliest examples of ironworking in Europe were conducted by Proto-Slavic peoples in the fertile and mineral-rich mountains of the region. This will be a running theme, as we'll soon see. But a more proper Silesian identity started to form in the later half of the first millennia, really crystallizing around 1000-ish AD, but plenty of was going on before then as well. The Silesians proper arose out of a great many different Slavic tribes of the region who practiced Slavic paganism, fortified the region and harvested minerals, assisted in defending their realm by the very, very dense old-growth forests of the region called the Brzezika. I think I got that right. I've been working on my Czech pronunciation. Hopefully it's paying off. Now, this brings us into the Middle Ages, where things start to get a lot more interesting for the Silesian region. Around this time, Silesia's big three neighbors really started to exert their influence, namely Bohemia, Poland, and Germany. Although, of course, all of these different powers went through a great many phases during this time. But cultural influence very much started to become a thing as the first millennium turned. And in the 1000s AD, Poland and Bohemia started to fight viciously over the region. This led to over a century of pretty much constant war, where the region was traded back and forth, and Poland established a bishopric there. And then there was a pagan uprising in like late 1000 AD to try to kick out the Catholic influence. It was just absolutely hectic. But in general, things started to kind of stabilize in the 1100s as a bunch of petty dukedoms within Silesia began to exercise their own autonomy. These dukedoms were eventually united in the 1200s AD, and immigrants began to absolutely flock to the region, pursuing the lucrative mining opportunities especially. Immigrants came even from as far as the Netherlands during this time, and Silesia began to gain some serious economic and therefore political clout around this period. But the gravy train was not necessarily to last forever, because on the horizon, who's that? Oh, it's 1240? It must be the Mongols. And boy, did they do a number on this part of Europe during this point in history. They came swarming in, but a great united coalition of Silesia and its neighbors managed to barely beat them back, all culminating in the climactic Battle of Legnica, where a united Silesian and allies coalition held out against seemingly innumerable Mongol opposition until a great relief force came riding in at the last moment to relieve them. And this was one of the nails in the coffin for the Mongol invasion of Europe, though of course they had done plenty of damage, leaving later generations to pick up the pieces. But after the Mongols were rebuffed, Silesia's neighbors got back up to their old tricks. And as such, not even a couple decades later, Bohemia began to capitalize on unrest in Poland to try to gain more influence in the region, and as such began to send forces through Silesia to try to make inroads into Poland. They ended up taking Silesia entirely for themselves, and certain parts of Silesia gained quite a lot of autonomy during this period, as well as continued economic influence. But this led to the 1400s, which was one of the messiest eras for the region. Economy-wise, they were prospering, but politically and socially, things were in near perpetual unrest. Not only was banditry incredibly common, and large swaths of Silesia were almost entirely ungoverned, but the Hussite rebellion cropped up within Bohemia, and Silesia actually emerged as one of the primary regions of opposition to the Hussite movement. With Bohemia unable to offer them any sort of proper law enforcement or protection, Silesia was forced to turn to other neighbors, creating pacts among city-states in order to guarantee mutual protection as best they could. Cities had to quickly rally militias in the face of religious fanaticism, robber incursions, and political plays made by local lords trying to ambitiously capitalize upon the relative lawlessness of the era. But finally, by the beginning of 1500, all of this tumult had settled into a very complex but relatively stable agreement where Silesia was still nominally under the yoke of Bohemia, but had quite a lot of autonomy and was, for all intents and purposes, a self-governing region. But that didn't mean that the 1500s was much easier for them. Even though the former century was marked by constant war and upheaval, that upheaval would continue into the 1500s, largely in the form of Protestantism. Though, as mentioned, Silesia was in a much better state during much of this period. A majority of the region converted to Lutheranism by 1530, making it one of the first and most Lutheran states in all of Europe, and reducing Catholic influence by as much as 90% by the tail end of the AoE2 relevant time frame. And more notably, the Habsburgs started to gain control over the area as they took the Bohemian throne. This is well after they got kicked out of Switzerland, but a little before they began to completely become pervasive across all of Europe. In gaining control of Bohemia, the Habsburgs started trying to take inventory of their land, and they realized, we have this huge chunk of the country that's pretty much doing whatever it wants. We should do something about that. And Silesians said, no, you absolutely don't. Which led to, you guessed it, yet another several decades of unrest and war. Silesia is eventually plundered and put under the boot heel of the Habsburgs, and an era of Protestant repression begins, though the Silesians would continue to fiercely resist this pretty much to the end of Habsburg influence in Bohemia. And that takes us well beyond the AoE2 relevant time frame, which leads us to the question, where is Silesia now? Well, Silesia was one of the first great industrialized powers of Europe, thanks in large part to the massive mineral wealth that even the early Proto-Slavs knew about, and it was traded back and forth between the three big usual suspects pretty much until right after World War II. These days, it is firmly a part of Poland, though a unique and autonomous Silesian cultural and social identity remains a fiercely prominent part of the region. Wow, that took me a while. More than a few takes to get all that out. And with that out of the way, let us move on to the flavor section. The lovely aesthetic touches that make an Age of Empires civilization what it is. To begin, architecture. The Silesians would use a West Slavic architecture that would be shared by a number of other civilizations as well. And for that, we are going to jump over to a presentation prepared by Tomáš himself. This was the one that influenced last week's presentation on Tibetan North Asian architecture. As we did before, I'm going to turn off my camera. We're going to go through this one nice and quickly and let Tomáš's research do the talking for us. Western Slavic architecture, to be shared by the Bohemians, my Moravians build, this Silesians build, and the Hungarians or Magyars civilization as well. Being in the feudal age, mostly simple log constructions, thatch is a common roof material, tutorial. Look at that cool looking house. This one is from an open air museum in Slavendorf in Germany. And though Tomáš doesn't here talk about a unique Dark Age look, I could see extrapolating this one out to Dark Age buildings as well. You even see more urbanized houses with more traditional thatched roofs, so that one we saw previously, maybe that could be a Dark Age house instead. And you see multiple floors emerging in houses even in the early Middle Ages, though Slavic people did not typically build cities. He has an example here of a wind-powered mill as well as a barn house that could be used for a feudal or Dark Age mill building, and for barracks he shows some traditional hill fort and gourd architecture with heavy use of palisades, ditches, and stone foundations. The market building could reflect a lot of the sensibilities we've seen thus far, with some temporary stalls thrown in there as well. But moving on to the Castle Age, you start to see larger cities in the region, Romanesque architecture, Gothic architecture would eventually come in, and half-timber construction starts to become prevalent, such as these beautiful semi-rural houses with plaster, multiple stories, and timber construction, and urban houses with tiled roofs and stone or brick constructions. These examples here are very indicative of what generally we're trying to go for with this design. And for military buildings, you see these beautiful orange-tiled turret roofs and mixed masonry walls, which I think could be nicely integrated into some of the other styles we've seen earlier as well. And of course, for monasteries, he gives us some classic Gothic examples, though I think you can see from the stonework on the upper one in particular, the color that is on display here is really, really remarkable, and the turreting style is also quite distinct from what we have currently in game. Lastly, in Imperial Age, we see Renaissance architecture making an inroad, as well as more ornate roof lines. He gives here some examples of what an Imperial Age town center or university could look like. Note in particular the incredibly intricate design patterns and the soaring spires. In summary, Western Slavic architecture would have some similarities to the current Eastern European architecture set, but would be much more grounded in reality, drawing from many of the same inspirations and sources that the current Central European architecture set does as well. And that is what the Western Slavic architecture set would look like. Huge thanks to Tomáš for putting that together. Hopefully that was nice and succinct for you guys. And so let's move on with some more flavor for this Silesians build. They'd have unique skins within the Western Slavic architecture set for both the castle, as is standard, and the market, which as we will see is a very important building for this civilization. And they would have an interesting combination of languages spoken in-game. From the beginning of the game, Silesian units would speak Polish, ladies and gentlemen. Then, come Feudal Age, their units would gain a 50% chance to speak Czech instead, Zdajbu. And lastly, starting in Castle Age, their elite military units, namely the ones that cost gold, excluding their unique unit, would instead exclusively speak Middle High German, Gluch auf. Tomáš even went out of his way to find greetings that would be more likely to be used in Silesia, thanks to its unique mining subculture. So make sure to check out the civilization document if you want to see a little bit more background about those. On next, to their wonder, it would be the great town hall of Wrocław, here depicted by an artist in the, I believe, 18th century, which is likely closer to how the building looked during medieval times than its current incarnation. It's a gorgeous building. It's absolutely iconic to the region, and it's an obvious pick for the Silesian wonder. Let's now look at a couple of AI player names. As per usual, I'm not going to go into depth on every single one of these, but make sure to check out the civilization document if you want to read these blurbs in full. And now that we've had a chance to see these, let's move on to campaigns. Tomáš came up with 3 potential campaigns for the Silesians, beginning with a more broad-scaling one, the Landfrieden Pact. This would be a story from the perspective of the Dukes of Silesia, effectively trying to keep peace in the realm as things are falling to anarchy in the 1400s AD. This would be when Silesian cities, unable to rely on the Bohemians to govern the region properly, started to turn to mutual protection agreements between each other to enforce law, and it would feature a variety of different threats over the span of several decades, with the Hussites eventually emerging as the foremost threat to the realm's integrity. It's a much more broad-scaling campaign than is normally proposed and doesn't focus on a single protagonist, but I think would do a great job of summarizing and illustrating Silesian history during what I would argue is the single most climactic and impactful point of their medieval history. That being said, if you want a more traditional campaign protagonist, look no further than Henry the Bearded. This handsome fellow would eventually reunite a fractured Poland in the 1200s AD, but was himself Silesian in origin. His campaign could feature German incursions, Polish and Silesian breakaway factions, and, if desired, even feature an epilogue a few years after his death of when the Mongols first began their invasion of Eastern Europe. He is an archetypal unifying figure, and I think could make for a classic classic Age of Empires campaign protagonist, but to feature a final, more unusual one, let's look at the city of Wrocław itself. This great metropolis is absolutely central to Silesia and has been the battleground of many of its most famous moments in history, such as the climax of the Mongol invasion and many more besides. And while Bari definitely falls flat on its face, you don't have to mythologize Wrocław by having its campaign focus around some fictionalized family. No, instead just take a couple of different important events that happened in and around Wrocław, and therefore have each scenario kind of lead the player throughout several centuries of Silesian development so they could see what, broadly speaking, was happening to the country through the lens of its foremost urban center. Definitely wouldn't be a standard Age of Empires campaign, but the Silesians are not a standard Age of Empires civilization, as we will get into later. Now, what about existing campaigns? Where might the Silesians appear there? Well, maybe in Jadwiga, if you wanted to add some variety to the Polish factions there. Maybe in Jędrzejczyk, if you wanted to add some variety to the Polish factions there. I couldn't really pick out any obvious places where the Silesians could feature. You could even have them in that Genghis Khan scenario where the Mongols are attacking Europe. Silesia was one of the main battlegrounds of the region, but looking through, I didn't really see an obvious place where they would fit. And as such, I think that most of the places you could put the Silesians into existing AoE2 campaigns are largely optional. That being said, to round off this flavor section, let's look at the last potential campaign idea that Tomáš mentioned to me, that being a historical battle-style one-off scenario depicting the Battle of Legnica. As mentioned before, this was the climax of the Mongol invasion of Europe, featuring a coalition of Silesians, Poles, Bohemians, Bavarians, and even Templars, all holding out on this one island of Wrocław as the Mongols besieged it. It was technically a loss, but they did manage to hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive very shortly thereafter. It could be an incredibly interesting scenario full of varied reinforcements and slowly giving ground as you conduct a destructive street fight through Wrocław, all culminating in the final epic defense of Ostrov Tomski Island. I think it could be incredible, and if for whatever reason we couldn't show this battle in a campaign like a unified Wrocław campaign or something like this, it would absolutely need to be a standalone scenario. Because this, in my opinion, is the single most intense and climactic thing that happened in all of Silesian history. And with all that, let's move on to some overarching themes identified by Tomáš and I as we were reviewing Silesian history. 1. Unified in disunity. I give Tomáš full credit for that snappy catchphrase. Silesia was barely a legal entity. They were constantly infighting with each other. There was unrest throughout a majority of its medieval history. It was very much a melting pot of the surrounding cultures. Bohemians, Germans, and Poles all rubbing shoulders along with the Silesians proper, and of course fighting each other. And though they bickered constantly, these disunified peoples were connected both through culture, as Silesia developed a fairly distinct culture to its neighbors, that its many ethnic and immigrant groups quickly adapted to and became a part of, as well as economic interests. Because man was Silesia wealthy, and who knows what its history would have looked like if there wasn't so much money to be made by colonizing and conquering the region. That brings us nicely to our second major theme, mintage. Silesia had tremendous mines and smelteries from early history. It had some of the earliest examples of European ironworking. We've already been over that. But Silesian coins permeated much of Europe during the Middle Ages while being highly regulated in Silesia itself. Don't get high off your own supply. Even though there were multiple different minting centers within Silesia that all minted different coins. Despite Silesia being so small and relatively unknown by modern audiences today, had a disproportionate impact on the broader economy of medieval Europe through its control of mineral wealth and European markets by way of its mintage. And this brings us to the last major theme Tomáš and I determined, namely, Silesia was really aggravating. It was a tremendous nuisance both to its neighbors, its conquerors, broader Europe, and itself. Now, why do I say this? Well, for starters, Silesian mintage crashed European markets on multiple occasions, partially because of the massive hegemony they had over European currency. And attempts to ban Silesian currency all failed because of how effective and also how pervasive it was. Another example, those massive forests that made Silesia incredibly hard to invade and occupy successfully were home to so many robbers that just made life miserable for anyone trying to extract wealth from the region. They would plunder trade carts, they would make life difficult, but they were an absolute fixture of the state during pretty much all of the Middle Ages. And another example, religious contrarianism. Remember how I said there was a pagan uprising in Silesia during the 1000s AD? Where do you hear about that in Central Europe? How about when they were fighting off the Hussites and then eventually became Lutherans and fought against the Habsburgs? Silesian history is marked by a religious contrarianism that I really haven't identified in any other part of the world, and led to them just being an absolute thorn in the ass of whatever theocracy was at the time trying to gain control over them. And with all of that, we've finally come to the end of the history section for this Silesian build. Thanks again, Tomáš, for all of your help with this. You are an exceptional collaborator, and this build would not have been possible without you, at least not nearly to the quality of research on display. And for all of you watching, if you were just here for the history, please make sure to like and subscribe before you go. But if you are like me and love Age of Empires and want to see what Tomáš and I have done with the Silesians as a civilization, let's move on to the game mechanics section, beginning with some necessary updates. If you've watched either my Moravians or my Novgorodians builds, you'll know what we're talking about right now. An overhaul of Slavic regional units, introducing two things. Firstly, the Gord, a defensive building available in Feudal Age, kind of like a Krepost, but worse. It can only be made in the line of sight of town centers, castles, and other Gords. It can train and upgrade the Druzhnik line, what are those? We'll get to those in a second, as well as Petards, and it costs 100 wood, 200 stone, and is quite quick to make for a defensive building. It is a great way to establish yourself early on in the game, protect incredibly effectively against early enemy aggression, and can later be used to kind of inch your way out over the map and reaffirm map control that you establish with things like castle drops. Second regional Slavic thing is the Druzhnik line. This becomes available in Feudal Age from the Gord, though it can also be trained in the Castle from Castle Age. It is a very strong infantry unit, upgradable to the Boyar Scion in Castle Age and the Boyar in Imperial Age. It can destroy almost any other unit 1v1, but you can only have a couple on the map at a time. In Feudal Age, for example, you can only have 3 Druzhniks in play at once, and this maxes out at 20 if you get Boyars in Imperial Age. As such, you have to be really cautious with how you're using your Druzhniks, as strong as they may be. They really have tremendous stats and are somewhat comparable to current Boyars. Obviously, the existing Slav unique unit would have to be replaced, but I don't care because I'm planning on splitting the Slavs into a bajillion other civilizations down the line. So ignore the discrepancy there. The Druzhnik is also quite cheap, costing only 45 food and 45 gold. However, if you right-click a Druzhnik on a stable, or you set a rally point onto a stable to have it do so automatically, the Druzhnik will mount up, transforming into a cavalry unit for an additional 20 gold, making it faster and tankier, but taking more damage from anti-cavalry units like spearmen. An incredibly powerful, versatile unit that, again, allows Slavic civilizations to get an edge early in the game and have an elite strike force later in the game, and nicely complements the defensive and map control elements established through their unique Gord building as well. Now, I should note that the Silesians would not have access to the Boyar, but would be able to upgrade their Druzhnik to Boyar Scions, so their Druzhniks aren't as good as usual, but what other civilizations would get these units? Well, the Bulgarians would, the Poles would, and the Bohemians would, though the latter two would have distinctly weaker ones than average. The Slavs would if they weren't being split, and my own Moravians and Novgorodians builds would both get them as well. The Krepost could probably stay as the unique building for the Bulgarians, maybe as a unique upgrade to the Gord, and I should note that the Lithuanians and Magyars would probably not be getting these units. While they share an architecture set with Slavic peoples culturally and militarily, they were very distinct, and I don't think it makes sense for them to get access to these regional units. Now that we have that context established, let us move on to an overview. The Silesians, an interference and gold civilization. What a weird civilization designation. Why interference? Well, as you'll see, the Silesians are very disruptive. It's a huge part of their game plan. Let's jump in to their bonuses. Silesian mining camps instantly harvest between 5 and 30 resources, depending on the age, from each gold and stone pile within 2 tiles when built. That means if you plop it down right in the middle of your normal 7-tile gold spawn at the beginning of the game, you're going to immediately have 35 gold just from creating your mining camp. A great tempo bonus that will always be nice but never too strong. It is obviously in reference to the massive mining economy that Silesia has enjoyed since before historical records began. This will also serve as their primary economy bonus in the early and mid game. Though while useful, I don't think it will have nearly enough power to truly warp their playstyle in any sort of tangible manner. Second bonus, from Castle Age, a single gourd may be upgraded into a mint. And what does a mint look like? Well, a mint can be accessed by clicking on a little icon on a given gourd's command card. It costs 200 gold and 100 stone on top of the gourd's existing cost to upgrade the gourd, and it overlays a little build animation, during which time the gourd can shoot, but cannot train anything. Now I should note, you can only have one mint on the map present at a time, so you need to be careful with where you build the thing, and it becomes a good deal tankier. But more importantly, a mint serves as a drop point for gold, giving 33% more yield than what a villager is holding when they drop off to it. So if you build a mint near one of your mines, it will allow for some seriously beneficial gold returns. And if you're on a map like Gold Rush, then forget about it. You've probably won if you manage to get a mint into the middle of that map. Now, the mint has 2 powers that can be clicked on within its command card. These share a 300-second cooldown, and each gets slightly weaker each time you use them. They're not technologies. They happen instantly and then have to wait before you use them again. The first one is called Crash Markets, and the second one is called Boost Markets. When you click the Crash Markets button, then every player map-wide gets minus 50% yield whenever they receive gold. That means through their miners, through trade, through selling at the market, everything, they'll just lose 50% of the gold they should have been getting. Boost Markets, on the other hand, does the exact opposite, increasing all gold yields by a massive 50%. And each of these effects lasts for 60 whole seconds and would send an alert to all players when they are researched, informing them of what has happened and how long it will be lasting for. Now, bear in mind, each time you use one of these effects, it becomes a little bit weaker, bottoming out at only having about a 10% effect on map-wide markets. So while it will always be usable at all stages of the game, it definitely needs to be timed properly to have maximum impact. And what separates good Silesian players from great Silesian players is knowing when to use Crash and Boost Markets to maximally screw over your opponent while benefiting yourself. Third bonus, let's move on. Setting a rally point on a town center, gourd, or a castle causes non-siege units to spawn inside that building when trained. This means that if you have a forward castle, you train a spearman at your barracks and you set a rally point on that castle, the spearman will teleport into that castle the second it is trained. So this obviously allows for massive mobility at the expense of much higher micro and is really good for things like forward castles, but where is it coming from? Well, as mentioned, especially during the 1400s, Silesian cities really had to stick together and form these mutual protection pacts, and were known for rapidly mustering large levy armies. And so this bonus is trying to reference this incredibly quick mobilization strategy that was so effective at protecting the realm during its most turbulent time frame. Fourth bonus, after redemption, monks can convert buildings at full range. This will let you do incredibly cheeky things like steal enemy towers from under their nose, or swipe a siege workshop on arena and train a battering ram in the opponent's base. It's an incredibly obnoxious technology and obviously has to do with Silesian religious contrarianism. Counter-religious movements were as common as mud during the Middle Ages in Silesia, and this is trying to represent that rebellious anti-religious streak. Lastly, team bonus. Steal 10% of the gold generated by enemy market sales. That means if an enemy sells 100 food for 50 gold, they get 45, and you get 5. In a team game, this applies to all enemies, and the stolen gold is distributed evenly across all your allies. So you won't be stealing more in team games than you would normally. Silesia was full of robbers, full of wealth, but it was very hard to extract it, and they bled Europe dry through their domination of the coin markets. I hope you can see now why the civilization is classed as interference and gold. It's the two big overarching themes of the Civ, and this team bonus really puts it together. For example, you want to boost the markets with mint. Your opponents are like, oh great, I'll use the opportunity to sell all of my extra wood and get some extra gold. And in the process, you're always going to be taking a cut of that. And so a canny Silesians player, if they have their timings down correctly and can guess what their opponent is going to do during a particular phase of the game, they can really gain a substantial economic advantage while being very obnoxious in the process. Let's move on to their uniques, beginning with their unique unit, the Raubritter. This is a raiding cavalryman. It is a robber knight, very, very common in Silesia during the Middle Ages, the kind of people to constantly infest those old growth forests I was talking about earlier. It costs 105 gold and nothing else, a gold-only cavalry unit. It's similar to a light cavalry. It's a little bit better overall in terms of its stats, but has lower speed and much lower line of sight, as well as notably being weak to monks to the same degree that a knight typically is, and having no bonus damage against them. So what's the benefit? Well, first of all, the Raubritter generates 5 gold per second while attacking eco units. That is a lot, meaning that if you can get them back into your opponent's trade line or wood line or something like that, they might be even able to pay for themselves if you let them fight enemy villagers long enough. But how are you going to get them into your opponent's economy? Well, the Raubritter can walk through forests. Ooh, that's very, very spicy. But I should note that while they are doing so, not only can they not attack, and can be attacked and seen as per normal, but they have minus 66% speed and are limited to only 1 line of sight. So they'll be quite vulnerable while they're traipsing through the forests, but it means that nowhere in your opponent's base is safe. They have to wall everything if they want to be guaranteed that your annoying little robber knights are not going to sneak their way into their farms late game. And so once again, interference and gold. The Silesian unique unit will be a plague on your opponent. Even if you never make one, they'll always have to live in fear that you will. And because of that, will help you control the pace of the game. Speaking of which, let's move on to their unique technologies, beginning with Brzezica. This was the name of the old growth forests that allowed Silesia to so effectively be protected from foreign invasion, and often dense sections of wood would even be used in the construction of walls within Silesian settlements. Because of this, the Brzezica technology allows palisade walls to grow stronger over time. The in-game model would even start to change as trees began to grow out of it and vines began to wrap up the logs of its construction. And this would cap out with the palisade wall being much, much tankier than when it was first built. Additionally, this technology would allow all Silesian palisade walls to be built into trees. The foundation could be placed, and the first time a villager hits it, the tree would vanish entirely, allowing you to use them to actually cut your way through forests if you were patient. And lastly, as a Brzezica palisade wall goes stronger, it will gain a stockpile of wood that eventually, if you deliberately task a villager onto it, they will cut down the wall and harvest it as though it were a tree. Is this a strong technology? I mean, not really, but it's a fun one and allows for some really funky defense/raiding/economy potential that might not be a cornerstone of the Silesian strategy, but will definitely be fun to make use of and might allow for some fun meme play, which I think will be a favorite of this civilization. And lastly, their Imperial Age unique technology is Landfrieden. This powerful tech, costing only 500 gold, I should note, unlocks all the Imperial Age unit upgrades of another chosen player, including their regional units. How would this work? Well, when you click the technology, on the command card, a bunch of little icons would show up showing every single player in the game and what civilization they were playing. And you could pick which one you wanted to target with Landfrieden. You could not, of course, re-research it to target a new person. That would be silly. When would my builds ever do something that ridiculous? But since it allows you to get regional units, it allows you to really customize your strategy based on who you are fighting, especially in team games. Of note, you would not be able to make regional units until you researched their Imperial Age upgrade. So say you targeted a civilization with camels, you could not make camel riders until you researched heavy cavalry. As we will soon see, the Silesian tech tree is incredibly sparse in terms of Imperial Age unit upgrades, and because of that, Landfrieden is almost 100% necessary if you are going to put up any sort of threat in post-Imperial scenarios. As always, make sure to check out the civilization document down in the description if you want any more details on any of these bonuses or technologies. Let's move on to the technology tree. Letter grades, Spirit of the Law style, beginning with their infantry. It's a B. They have the Družinik upgrading into the Boyar Scion, which is definitely going to help a little bit in early mid-game, and their Landfrieden technology helps make up for their lack of both Halberdier and Champion, which is not a good place for their infantry to be, but most civilizations will have at least one of those two, and some will even have useful regional units that you'll be able to steal as well. That being said, they do lack supplies and arsons. So while Landfrieden will help make up for some of the weaknesses with the Silesians' infantry, they're not necessarily something you're going to rely upon unless you get lucky and maybe grab elite Eagle Warriors or something like that. Though I should note, the rally point bonus will typically be more useful for infantry since they are slow. Secondly, archers. It's a B. They have the hand cannoneer, but they don't have heavy cavalry archer or arbalester or thumb ring, meaning that even if you get a civilization with Lönfrieden that is going to give you arbalester, they're still not going to be fully upgraded. That being said, hand cannoneers are nice, they have elite skirmishers, and crossbow play is going to be pretty good in Castle Age even if they don't have thumb ring. I should note, by the way, that the Silesians have a perfect blacksmith, so smith technologies are never going to be your limiting factor with their main 3 unit types. Next, cavalry. It's a B. Are you sensing a pattern yet? Once again, they have the Družinnik and Boyar sign, which is kind of a cavalryman, and their Raubritter is, of course, a cavalryman as well. But they lack bloodlines, and that sucks. On the other hand, though, Lönfrieden is going to be especially helpful with cavalry since the vast majority of regional units in the game are cavalrymen. So you can easily play elite battle elephants with the Silesians just as much as you could play elite steppe lancers. It entirely depends on your matchup. I could see any of these grades being reduced to a B- depending on someone's personal preference, but I think that versatility makes up for a lot of their innate weaknesses, and a full blacksmith always helps. Their siege, on the other hand, leaves more to be desired. It's a B-. While the Silesians do have bombard cannon, they miss pretty much all the other Imperial Age siege upgrades, and that hurts. Plus, no siege engineers, and if you don't have siege engineers, you're pretty much never higher than a B- for siege in my book, unless you have a perfect workshop tech tree otherwise. Their defenses, on the other hand, are an A-. The Gord automatically makes defensive play early on much more viable. The rally point bonus kind of helps out. And you also have Przezika if you're feeling a little bit memey. Their university is almost perfect as well. So in summary, as the Silesians, defensive play is going to be part of your strategy in most cases, at least at some point during the game, usually early on. Though, of course, as mentioned, that rally point bonus can turn their defenses into a more offensively useful weapon at some point in the game, especially if you're doing something like a castle drop. Economy. It's an A. They have their mining camp bonus as well as stealing market stuff. They have their mint. They have Przezika to cut down your palisade walls. The Raubritter generate stuff, and they have all economy technologies besides crop rotation. Their economy is a very weird one, though. They don't have a ton of raw power because, like, yeah, they can get a bunch of gold. Their mining camps get some free stuff, but those things aren't, like, stupidly helpful. The thing that makes their economy an A is the fact that they'll make their enemy's economy drop at least 1 letter grade purely by being disruptive and annoying. And that's enough to elevate what might be a B+ otherwise into the A territory in my book, at least. If you're playing the Silesians, you're playing an economy-focused game and you're trying to make your opponent's life hard. Levies. It's a C, although this is kind of a weird grade. They don't have Halberdier, Hussar, or Bloodlines, though Halberdier or Hussar could be made up for through Lönfrieden, and they still are very good in Trash Wars because of all the gold stuff they have, like making their opponent get less gold for late game units. They get more gold for late game units. But even so, it feels kind of weird to give their levies a good grade just because they have good late game endurance. So we'll call it a C with an asterisk that their post-Imperial is still very good, even though their levies aren't really anything special until you get Lönfrieden out. Next, Dock. It's a C-. It's doo-doo. They're missing a ton of Imperial Age ship upgrades, but they also don't have dry dock or shipwright. So even if you use Lönfrieden, you're still going to have a crappy dock. Don't play the Silesians on water unless you're doing some big meme team island thing where you can make use of all their economic control options. And lastly, for monks, it's a B. They're missing some key monk technologies, specifically Sanctity and Theocracy really hurts. But Distant Redemption is pretty good. Like, I'm not too worried about their missing monk technologies because purely through Distant Redemption, you're going to have a whole bunch of new strategic options unlocked for you, especially on Arena. Other than that, though, their monks are not going to be useful beyond monk things, so I think a B overall is the best way of grading it. Oh, and of course, you will have a lot of gold as well, and having more gold makes monks more affordable, so that is another small point in their favor to boot. How about their playstyle, though? What will the average Silesian game look like in my estimation? Well, to begin with, in the early game, your economy is only okay pretty much until you hit Castle Age. Yeah, you have your mining camp, and that's kind of nice. You have some market stuff, but more importantly, your rushes are not fantastic. You don't have supplies for your men-at-arms, though that's not usually that important, and your scouts don't have bloodlined, which sucks. But your archers are pretty good, and you have Družinniks if you want to do some sort of Družinnik rush if you manage to get up a really early Gord. So overall, early game, your aggressive options are only so-so, and your economy is not amazing, but you do have Gords. So just try to stay defensive and get your way through to Castle Age using your Gords to stave off enemy attacks. The mid-game, however, is when the Silesians start to kick into gear. They get to dictate the pace of play through using their mint to control amount of gold being gained by both players, using the market to disrupt enemy tempo strategies, and using forward castles and palisades to restrict mobility and gain map control. Forward castles in particular are going to be one of the Silesians' favorite aggressive plays because they can immediately reinforce them with their rally point bonus. Your goal is to be annoying with the Silesians. Use monks to remotely convert enemy buildings and produce units in their base. Use Raubrittas to run through forests and attack their woodlines when they aren't expecting it. You're trying to keep your opponent off kilter because in terms of a raw power slugfest, you are almost always going to lose. This is less bad in Castle Age, but once you start to hit Imperial Age, you will really fall off until you research Landfrieden, which will completely change how you approach the game. It makes the Silesians quite matchup dependent in 1v1, because plenty of enemy civilizations are going to be way better at using the units you are stealing than you will be. And as such, you're still pretty much going to be on the back foot in late game, but at least you're competitive, and you do still have a great economy. So while you won't be able to necessarily win most frontline engagements, you'll be able to dictate the pace of play as well as you were doing before, and use your obnoxious options to keep hamstringing your opponent's economy, so hopefully they can't just outproduce and outmuscle you. I should note though that at any stage of the game, the Silesians are particularly good in team games. In my opinion, this is coming from three major reasons. First of all, because they are both good on defense, they're good with raiding, and they're good at slinging, I can see them being pretty viable in any given position in a team game. Secondly, in a team game, you will naturally have more options for Landfrieden, allowing you to customize your strategy more precisely to what your allies need of you. And lastly, your eco stuff is going to be especially good in teams. Raubrittas are fantastic at disrupting trade lines. Enemies tend to use markets a little bit more in team games. And disrupting gold economies through your mint is going to be even more impactful when you can coordinate with your allies so that you guys can capitalize on a change in the markets while your opponents are left floundering and playing catch up. Let's move on to some loose threads. Now that we have the build behind us, let's talk a little bit about some uncertainties I had surrounding this build and some ideas that Tomáš and I had that didn't quite make our final incarnation. To begin with some uncertainties, this really does look very annoying. Like, I'm not sure I would have a fun time playing against this build of the Silesians. At least they don't tower rush, but they do look quite obnoxious, and I could see that being rather disliked, but also quite fun. Like, there's always a place for meme civilizations in the game, and this build certainly has more than a little bit of meme potential. Second of all, they really have a lot of dependency on Landfrieden to give them any hope in post-Imperial Age, and even then, they're almost always going to be outmatched late in 1v1s. I'm not sure that is a good place to be, and it could really warp how the civilization approaches the game, but it also just could be a feature rather than a bug. Like, I could see that being kind of an interesting dynamic where your late economy and raiding is awesome, but your late frontline is always going to be on the back foot to your opponent. I've done stuff like that before, and this is just kind of a new way of approaching a similar dynamic, which I find relatively compelling. And lastly, I could see us calling it an economy civilization rather than a gold civilization. I mean, I'm already giving them some very weird civilization monikers, but these sort of classifications should be used to help people find what they are looking for when approaching the game more effectively, and I'm just not sure whether the current tags are misleading. That being said, those uncertainties aside, some tabled ideas. Let's go through these on the quicker side. One, having Brzezica instead of a Castle Age unique technology be like an upgrade that you can give to Palisades from Dark Age. The annoying thing though would be it would have to be individual. And so I thought that the Brzezica effect would be too strong if they had it by default from the beginning of the game, and upgrading individual segments of walls sounded like an absolute chore, so a Castle Age unique technology was the best way to condense all of these disparate ideas. Another one, the mint generates gold when buildings are built next to it. The current drop point mechanic that it has is probably a cleaner way of doing this, but I did kind of like the, gold folwark idea where when you build houses, they generate you gold because it represents kind of a urbanization and a concentration of the coin economy. The mint went through a lot of different incarnations between Tomáš and I think that the current one is probably the best blend of conventional and unusual. Next, Imperial Age blacksmith technologies are stolen from your enemies and shared with your team. Stealing technologies was obviously a theme for the Silesians from the very beginning, but in this case, they had really good blacksmiths of their own, so it felt like kind of a flavor fail, as well as the fact that, once again, you'd be waiting for your opponent to do something and playing catch up to them. And too much of that would definitely make the civilization feel very, very underwhelming. Another one, Silesia had a booming clothing economy, and as such, what if Loom were researchable at various stages of the game, but gave much less benefit? But hitting more different units, not just villagers. Like, what if it gave 5 hit points to all your villagers and soldiers? That could be quite cool. Quite cool indeed. It just didn't end up being a good place to fit it into the build based on our current incarnation. Another one, the rally point idea could teleport certain units to like enemy town centers and monasteries and castles, representing rebels just kind of like popping out from the woodwork to drive yet another invader out of Silesia. Fun idea, but wow, would this one be tilting. I think that the current remote garrison in one of your own buildings is a much more reasonable way of approaching something like this, and even that is definitely pushing the limit. And yet another one, enemy market prices crash harder but start the same. This is just kind of another incarnation of the current team bonus where you steal a bit of enemy market sales, and I like that one better because it fits the theme a lot more, as well as having markets change at different rates, as I learned with my Dutch build, is not necessarily a super clean thing to implement in game. Nextly, a couple of alternative names for the unique Raubritter. That is obviously a German phrase, but in Czech, let's see if I can do this, could do Zemski Skutje, or Lupezivi Rytierz. I think I got those ones correctly. Tomáš noted that the second one would sound very, very silly to many Czech speakers. And so even though Raubritter is a German loanword, German was spoken very often in Silesia, and it is a perfect description of what the unit actually is. A robber knight pillaging the landscape. Another idea in regards to the Raubritter was giving them a dodge shield while they were in forests. This way, if you happen to traipse past an enemy castle, it wouldn't just kill you immediately while you're slow and vulnerable. And of course, forests are protective, you know? It's hard to kill people in forests. It's hard to shoot them especially. And so I think a dodge shield could be a very reasonable addition. I just didn't want to have it from the very get-go because I think that the walking through forests thing will already be kind of spooky for a lot of people, and having it be even harder to kill the Raubritter while it's doing so might be feels bad, man. But this would be something I'd be very willing to add if the unit felt underpowered. Another one, a potential unique unit, a merchant guard of some kind. We never really crystallized what this would look like, but it would kind of be the other side of the coin to the Raubritter, the ones who were tasked to actually try to protect all the valuable cargo going in and out of Silesia. My best idea was like a heavy infantryman that maybe was faster if it was tasked to guard a unit, like it would match the speed of the unit it was guarding so it could keep up with a trade card. That's a cool idea, just not as fun as the one we came up with. A mine shaft unique building that would give infinite mineral resources but was dangerous and expensive to use. This is something I think I'd like to implement for all civilizations at some point. Not to say that I don't like introduce an idea I have as a more broad scale change in a build and then iterate on it later on. But the Mint was a lot more fun, and there's only so many unique buildings a civilization can take before it feels bloated. And lastly, another unique building, a guild house. This was a very common thing in Silesia, and this would be an eco building that could be like crewed by villagers, kind of like a feitoria, but you can choose how many guys are in it, and would generate resources based on its proximity to other eco buildings, encouraging you to like cluster them together and urbanize, as Silesia did when it became one of the first great industrial powers of Europe. Very flavorful, another thing I could see implementing across many civilizations, and a cool idea, but much like with the mineshaft, there just wasn't room for it. I prefer the more daring, sabotaging approach we went with rather than a safer, pure economy design. And with all that, we finally come to the end of this Silesians build. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. A huge round of applause for our friend Tomáš. His knowledge was indispensable, and he was very fun to collaborate with. I certainly hope we'll be seeing him on this channel in future. Before we leave, likeliniometer. In my opinion, on a scale from 1 to 10, how likely is it that the Silesians, maybe looking a little something like this build here, could be implemented in the game at some point in the future? And on the likeliniometer for the Silesians, we have a 1 out of 10. The first in the channel's history. Woo! And there was much rejoicing. Congratulations, Silesians. You're never getting added. And it's no surprise. They are a relatively obscure piece of history. They're very, very niche, and even Tomáš himself said there's no way these guys are getting added, but it was a part of history that he thinks is really underrepresented and cool. And at the end of the day, that's what this channel is about. We're not here just for the 10 out of 10s, guys. We're here for the 1 out of 10s as well. And I certainly hope that you think this build was interesting and you learned something about the history, despite it almost certainly never being added to the game. But that's just what I think. Now I want to hear what you think. Did you enjoy the build? What would you do differently? Did you learn something new? And what would you like to see me do on this channel in future? Don't forget, to join the Discord server, link down in the description below. We're going to do some fun stuff going forward, and if you ever want to talk to me about one of my builds or one of your own builds or something else besides, then make sure to hop on there and take a look at the upcoming office hours times. It's going to be starting next week. Again, link down in the description. Go join whenever you can if you have a Discord and want to use it. But until then, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.